Look, I just wanted to, in terms of the LGFA update, was probably to focus on just provide you with a bit of a quick update on our borrowing and lending activities, give you a bit of a refresh on our credit rating and as to why that's so important for the health of the sector. And then also the long-term plans have just been released, so that's obviously very important for the councils, part of their process. And we've just quickly gone through, I think, 78 councils, LTPs, and we've started to put together some observations and some conclusions on the outlook for sector debt as well. So that's an ongoing process, probably over the next 2 quarters. But in terms of the LGFA update then, slowly creeping towards 100% coverage of the sector. We had 3 councils join in the June year to 2018. We've had 2 more councils join in July, so that puts us up to 58 council members. There's obviously 78 councils in New Zealand, 11 don't have debt, so our universe is 67 councils. And we'll be expecting probably another 4 councils to join in the next 5 or 6 months. It is LTP year, and what tends to happen is that councils reassess the benefits of joining LGFA in those long-term plan years, and we always get a spike in membership. So hopefully in about 2 quarters' time we should be up to probably 62 council members, so very, very strong. Our lending to councils is still remaining robust. We have around about 70% market share of all council borrowing in the past year. Obviously, to be able to lend to councils, we have to keep up our investor engagement, and it's still very pleasing to see that offshore investors still comprise around 40% of our bond holders. It's very important for us to be able to pass on those interest savings to councils, that we don't just rely upon domestic banks and domestic investors. Theme in the last couple of quarters has been just watching the offshore investors. Clearly, the New Zealand dollar is actually going down. Interest rates around the world are going up. Inflation is going up as well too. So we are carefully monitoring the offshore investor support. Offshore investors own around 60% of New Zealand government stock, and they are having a declining trend in their holdings. So we're just very wary of the need to continue the support of offshore investors. Over the last 3 months since we last did this update, hasn't really been a lot of change in terms of interest rate markets and credit markets. Interest rates are slightly lower, but credit spreads are relatively unchanged. So borrowing costs for the sector are probably slightly lower than where they were 3 months ago. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Thank you. So as I sort of said on the top left-hand side, just membership. So as you can see, there's always a spike in the LTP years. So 2012, 2015 and 2018, we're expecting an increase in membership to actually flow through there. So you can sort of see on the right-hand side, we're gradually colouring in the rest of the country as well too. So working really on the lower South Island at the moment. A number of those councils down there low are councils with no debt. So we're not going to expect to colour in the entire country, but we'll try and get as close as we can to it. Just in terms of the credit rating of LGFA, it's just important just to understand the credit rating. So similar to what Toby does in terms of the council mark assessment, the credit rating, we have credit ratings by 2 international credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's and Fitch. They also assess the central government. The credit rating is really an independent assessment of the credit quality of a borrower. It's the ability to meet financial obligations. There are 10 agencies very similar to LGFA around the world. We model ourselves on the Nordic countries, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark. They've had agencies like LGFA. Well, we've only been going for 6 years. Some of the Northern Hemisphere agencies have been going for over 100 years. So that was a model where we first set up that we looked towards. So we're assessed within that group as well too. there's been a slight change in the methodology by Standard & Poor's. So up until May of this year, the Standard & Poor's approach was to treat us as if we were a government agency who happened to be a financial institution. Now, where they've changed now is that they're saying you're all financial institutions who happen to be owned by governments. So just a slight change in focus. So they look at us as a standalone financial institution first, as opposed to a government entity. So they're treating us more like a bank. But what's important is that regardless of the change in methodology, we still have the same credit rating of AA+. We score very strong or strong on 4 of the 5 criteria that they actually rate us on. The only criteria where we are slightly below our peer group is our capital adequacy. And that's while we're very strong from a capital perspective, when they look at us from a concentration point of view, because of our top 20 councils, 80% of our lending book, they lower our assessment based on that. But as we say to the rating agencies, because we cover the entire country, we can't do a thing about that. You know, the top 20 councils are the largest borrowers. So, and if they're borrowing most of their funding through us, then obviously we will have some concentration risk. Really importantly though, we are capped by the New Zealand government. We have the same credit rating as the New Zealand government at AA+. And so that's really important for us for our model. We are a cheap provider of debt to the sector. We save the local government sector between 0.2 and 0.3% per annum. Doesn't sound a lot when you talk about that, but when you look at the sector debt, on sector debt at the moment around about $15 billion, we're saving the local government sector between $30 and $45 million per annum. When you look at the LTPs in the next couple of slides, you see that sector debt's projected to rise to $25 billion in 10 years' time. So we'll be saving the sector then probably between $50 million and $75 million per annum. So over a 10-year LTP cycle, that's almost $500 million to $750 million of savings that we're generating for the sector. So really important for us to maintain the same credit rating as the New Zealand government. Very important for us to maintain the confidence of the offshore investors so that we can then provide those savings onto the sector. So the long-term plans, as I said, it's probably a really big piece of work for us. It is very difficult going through, and I'm not doing it, thank goodness, but very difficult reading 78 councils LTPs. They sort of vary between, I think, 20 pages and about 600 pages. So they're very comprehensive documents. So we've just done a very high level assessment so far, really focusing initially on debt and borrowing and investment, but we'll extend that over the next couple of months. Probably the general observations are, look, there is a widespread increase in infrastructure investment occurring or forecast to occur in the next 10 years. The key surprise for us is not just the metro councils. Is actually widespread throughout the whole country, and I'll show you some data on that very shortly. The projected debt increases aren't out of line or sync with previous LTPs as well. So while debt projections seem to be large, you've got to remember that as there's a need for increased investment in infrastructure, there's got to be an increased level of borrowing as well too. Probably our only concern still is whether or not there's sufficient capacity to actually deliver on the infrastructure. In previous LTPs, the rule of thumb has been to discount borrowing and investment intentions by around 20% to 25%. So if a council says they're going to do 100 million of infrastructure investment, we usually assume about 75 million will be actually delivered. But what will be the big question this time around, though, is obviously there's a lot more appetite from central government and for local government, I think, to actually deliver on this infrastructure because there is growth requirements, there's regulatory requirements occurring because it's also across the entire country. It's not just focused on one or two areas. So those are general observations. Just the next couple of slides is just a bit of background from some of the data, but also looking back historically. This data here is the council debt levels for the last 5 years, but also the aggregation going forward under the 1828 LTPs. The blue line is the Metro Council debt, and the orange line is the total sector debt. What we're trying to show here is that around 76 to 78% of the sector debt is Metro debt. So that's kind of consistent, but I think what we're trying to say here, though, is that going forward, it is the entire sector that's actually got the borrowing requirement and the infrastructure requirement. At first, as I said, we thought it was just going to be a focus on the high growth metro councils, but that's not the case. The implication for that, though, is that obviously all councils require additional revenue and additional funding tools. Central government and local government shouldn't just be focusing on some of the high growth metro councils. It doesn't matter if you're a provincial council or up in Auckland or Tauranga, you're still going to require additional revenue to service this additional debt. Slide 7 is the is a crowded chart, but what we wanted to show here was the in yellow is the actual debt levels going back the last 5 years now. The blue is the 2012 LTP forecast for debt going out for the next 10 years out to 2022. The orange line is the debt forecast of the sector back in 2015 for the 2015-25 LTPs, and the important one now going forward is the grey line, which is the debt forecast of the sector under the 2018 to 28 LTPs. So at this stage, sector debt is likely to increase by, if it all does get borrowed and does get invested, around 61% between 2018 and 2028. So sector debt will rise from 16 billion to 26 billion. But put in perspective, the 12-22 LTP had sector debt going up by 86% over that 10-year cycle. Second point to note is that the starting point for 18-28 LTP is actually slightly lower than what was forecast in the 15 to 25 LTP. And that's simply because, as I said before, about the inability of councils to have actually delivered on all their infrastructure forecasts and all their borrowing. But as I said, I think this time around, I think if you can solve the capacity constraint, which could be there, I think there's an increasing willingness from politicians and also management to actually deliver on this infrastructure. And so we'll do more on the revenue side for the LTPs at the next quarterly briefing. In terms of just some interesting observations that we've picked up upon as we've been putting together the data set. Top left-hand side is just historical levels of debt within the sector and also the assets. So as you can see, assets have been climbing over the last 16 years from 40 billion up to around about 120 billion. Debt has been increasing at a more moderate pace, but as you look on the right-hand side there, it has started to accelerate relative to assets over the last 4 years. That leverage is still acceptable and we're comfortable with that. Part of that story, of course, is that assets are depreciating at the same time as well too. Bottom left-hand side, when you look at debt to operating revenue, what's important here, so historical debt is actually increasing faster than historical operating revenue of the sectors. So again, it's sort of showing this revenue shortfall that's actually occurring within the local government sector relative to its investment and its debt levels. So again, this is reiterating the point of the need to get further revenue tools into the sector because obviously that line cannot keep on going up. Revenue has not actually kept pace with debt that has been put on for infrastructure investment over the last 10 years. And then finally, bottom right, look, you can skin all this data how you like and present it. This is just probably, there's a perception out there, I think, in the public that staff costs, wage costs, that the sector is overstaffed and overpaid. What we've done here, again, just looking at the data, is looking at employee costs divided by operating expenses. And as you can sort of see, they've been relatively stable over the last 15 years now. Around about 23% of operating expenditure has actually been on employee costs. despite the growth in council activities and the growth in council balance sheets, it's been held relatively the same. So again, just an interesting snippet that we've sort of come across as we've been analysing our data.